Hello, I hope you're staying healthy and well. Thank you for joining us today for the seventh edition of the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series. I'm Mustafa Alrawi, Assistant Editor-in-Chief at The National, where we've been covering the Zayed Sustainability Prize for more than a decade. So I'm very pleased to be moderating this event. We have a very esteemed panel with us, but before we get to introducing them, I'd like to talk a little bit about the prize. It was established in 2008. It's the UAE's Pioneering Global Award for recognizing sustainability, innovation, and humanitarian solutions. The Zayed Sustainability Prize counts 13 years of global impact, with its 86 winners to date having collectively impacted the lives of over 352 million people around the world across the categories of health, energy, water, and global high schools. So before I get to the mentioned panel, it's worth framing this discussion. On the 23rd of September, the UN convened the Food Systems Summit, essentially a very big discussion, thousands of people attending online, on how we can feed the world population while taking into account climate change. The panel today is going to discuss some of the solutions that we have or we're working on for that, as well as some of the challenges, some of the cooperation that's ongoing between countries, institutions, and companies. It is alarming what's going on with climate change, but I think there are a lot of people working on these problems together. So today we're going to discuss some of that in detail. So first, allow me to introduce Her Excellency Mariam Almheiri, Minister of Climate Change and Environment. In 2017, she became the first ever minister to be assigned a food security portfolio globally. In her role, she oversees the development of the necessary infrastructure that would ensure the country's food security objectives in line with the UAE Centennial 2071 plan. Minister Almheiri is an esteemed jury member of the Zayed Sustainability Prize. Also with us is Mr. David Rosenberg. He's joining from Aero Farms. He's co-founder and CEO, and he's been leading the company's work on vertical farming, which is at the forefront of changing the landscape of agriculture. Welcome to you both. Minister Almheiri, perhaps I could start with you to kind of understand from your position the big picture on this mission of addressing food security, both locally and globally. The commitment is culminated in an initiative called Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, AIM for Climate, which will be launched in partnership with the US at COP26 next month. How do you expect AIM for Climate to deploy R&D and science to transform agriculture systems globally?
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Thank you to all the viewers and listeners. We're very happy to be here and have this discussion with you. Mustafa, I'd like to just explain first a little bit of a background before I go into AIM for Climate. So it is our duty now to really move into our decade of action towards the SDGs. And the only way we can do that when we look at our food systems is we must transform our food systems into more sustainable, more inclusive food systems, because we know that the food systems as they are now are very inefficient. The number of hungry people are going up, the number of obese people are going up. And so with that, and of course the waste as well, we have a third of all the food produced going to waste. So when you look at all those numbers, you're like, something is wrong with our food systems. So we must go through this transformation. And Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, or AIM for Climate, has been basically pushed forward. It's going to be launched officially at COP26 in partnership with the United States of America. And we're pushing this forward to basically accelerate the agenda of research and development in food systems. So it's really important here that we're looking for partnerships. We're looking to enable science-based and data-driven decision and policy making. We want to make sure that the goals that, or we take that holistic approach to ensure for diversity, gender equality, inclusion. These are all these are the values of what this initiative is about, and getting countries on board to say, you know what, we want to commit investment human resources into actually pushing the R&D agenda for the next 5 years to really transform our food system. So that's what Aim for Climate is about. And for us in the UAE, one of the things we're very proud of that we launched, which sits nicely with the Aim for C initiatives, is the Food Tech Valley. So the Food Tech Valley is basically an ecosystem that helps bring future tech-enabled food systems into play. It's basically a playground to be able to look at all these new food systems.
Thank you, Minister Almheiri. I'll pick up on that point you raised about what's wrong with food systems. So it's a segue to bring in David Rosenberg, who working at Arrow Farms on a new way of growing food. Agriculture has been impacted obviously by climate change. We all know this, but you're working on something that could mitigate the impact. Can you tell us more about vertical farming, how you see it addressing some of the related challenges such as water scarcity or soil degradation? How does vertical farming potentially help us build more resilient food systems to fix the problems that we have in the existing system?
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for the invitation, and an honor to be with you both and share the stage. And it's especially important because it's so vital that the private sector and innovators collaborate with policymakers to push solutions faster. And there's a lot that's being done, a lot more we need to do. To answer your question, first, vertical farming, we define it as layer upon layer of growing plants. So we grow plants without sun, without soil. Plants don't need sun, they need spectrum at certain intensities, frequencies. They don't need soil, they need nutrients and micronutrients. And if a plant wants, one way to quantify, to visualize this, if a plant has a certain specification between, in Fahrenheit, let's say 75 degrees plus or minus 3 degrees, in the field, there's a lot of variability when it's very hot or very cool. In a greenhouse, there's a lot of variability when it's very hot or very cool. In essentially a warehouse with controlled environments, we can give the plant exactly what it wants, how it wants it, when it wants it, to optimize plant growth. So at Arrow Farms, we're excellent at understanding how a plant could be the best it could be, and then what to give it to be the best. And that's humidity, temperature, CO2 levels, airflow, nutrients, micronutrients, all these different factors. So we have tremendous amount of yield at a very small footprint. And this is important back to the other part of the question, is the state of the world as our food production systems are today. And we've worked hard to bring costs down as society. We've worked hard to bring costs down. And what that's meant is centralized food production. So we have a centralized food system, and we've seen it in COVID, where if there's a crack in the system, that means the reverberations are all over the world. And that's basically empty food shelves. So from a food security standpoint, our centralized food system puts a lot of risk in the supply chain, in the whole value chain. So part of what, at the essence of vertical farming, it's about building these anywhere, whether it's on the equator, the North Pole, anywhere. And that's about democratizing our food production systems. We're taking the risk out of that centralized production and enabling local areas to self-produce, to be self-sufficient. And what that also does is it actually de-risks, from a food safety standpoint, contamination, because if there's a micro contamination, often it spreads, and there's a macro contamination that starts from a small spot. So we're also making our food systems not only more resilient, but safer. And then the other dynamic, of course, with produce, fruits and vegetables, is the shelf life. It's not like making a phone or a widget or something that has a long shelf life. Here, it's a highly perishable product that starts dying as soon as it's harvested. So here, putting production closer to where people are eating it, you extend the shelf life and produce a lot less waste. And part of the environmental impact is, the mantra is, how do you do more with less? So here, we could produce a lot more that's not only grown, but eaten. And that's the key word, what's eaten, not just what's grown, with a lot less resources. So it's providing a lot of resiliency. And here, the policyholders, as one puts metrics and higher standards on water use, on waste, all these different attributes, it could drive the innovators in the private sector to solve problems. So it's a great collaboration, and I would say there's a lot of wonderful leadership going on in the UAE. Thanks in great part to our wonderful minister here joining us today.
Thank you, David. You mentioned the science, the innovation, de-risking the food system, at least on a local level, democratizing it. And it's a quite exciting vision. But you also mentioned politics. So we're at a critical juncture for the future of food. The end of last month, as I mentioned, we had the UN Food Systems Summit in New York. There was an announcement of new commitments for fostering the transformation that's needed. But ahead of COP26, food systems will be top of mind for intergovernmental organizations, countries. Can building sustainable food systems as a way of mitigating climate change, or for humanitarian reasons, or some of the other reasons that David, you mentioned, how this is very, very urgent, and how do we make sure that it remains urgent, in discussions like COP26? And really, I'd be interested in Minister Almheiri's thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, we can really say the good thing is we just had the United Nations Food Systems Summit. COP26 is just around the corner. So really the hype we've had also during the UN Food Systems Summit, I think the team just did such a great job in getting all the leaders to actually give statements, commit, think about, reflect on food systems within their countries. I mean, you had thousands of national dialogues happening and all over the country. People started to communicate about what food systems mean, because if we look at it, food systems are the problem, but they are also the solution. So it really is hand in hand of how it's also connected. I mean, water, food, energy is all interlinked, and the food systems affect our climate, and the climate also affects the food system. So everything's interlinked together. So making sure that we're looking at smart systems. I mean, David explained aero farms, vertical farms. This is a great example of how technology and innovation can be used to actually think of new food systems which are more climate friendly, which are smart, which save natural resources. And this really shows, especially for countries like the UAE, we don't have arable land, we don't have a massive annual rainfall. So we have to really innovate and think of how we can harness technology to think of how we can recirculate water in the systems, how we can grow food differently and sustainably. And this is where the UAE also wants to make sure that we are, for us, all the national initiatives that we're thinking about is also to create that knowledge and experience that we need to then hopefully become a hub of technology innovation for other countries that are also facing the same kind of or have the same environment and face the same challenges as we are. So the UAE really strives to become this hub of technology and innovation, and also because we see ourselves as responsible global citizens as well. We thankfully have the resources to build ecosystems, to attract foreign investments into the country, to attract entrepreneurs, innovators in this field, and enable them, such as aero farms coming here to Abu Dhabi here in the UAE, to actually come set base here and actually grow a vertical farm in a country like the UAE. And then they're going to do their fine tuning, just as David explained, because their farm here will be slightly different than the farm elsewhere. I mean, inside it might be the same, but you've got the different markets, you've got the different consumers as well. So that's going to be a little bit different. But it's going to be exciting just to see how we can really empower closed environment agriculture in countries such as the UAE to then take that knowledge and bring that to other countries as well. And also, David mentioned something really important. It's all about really reducing cost, because it's all connected: energy, water, and food. And so fine-tuning technology as well to really bring down production costs and make it affordable, that everyone can have access to clean, sustainable food?
So, I mean, making the political advances really does depend on showing that it works, that you have solutions that can be shared and that can be viable. And David, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing in the UAE, since Minister Almheiri brought it up.
Yeah, happy to. And to build off what Minister Almheiri just mentioned is, as an entrepreneur, like, we have to decide where we want to go, where we prioritize. As it relates to the prioritization, especially building new projects and where to innovate, one thing we look for is like where there's high political will, or where there's high pain. So going to the UAE and building a huge R&D facility in the UAE made sense because there's pain, meaning, like the minister said, there's not a lot of arable land, there's not an abundance of water. So here there's a pain of locally sourcing food. And then there's high political will. Fortunately, there's a lot of resources, like the minister said. So here the world needs leadership, and the world needs examples of what technology can do. So in the UAE, we have that leadership, and that makes the de-risking of certain elements about growth. It's really hard to be an entrepreneur. It's hard to scale an innovative company. And we want to put ourselves in a situation where we could succeed, where we have these examples that could be a beacon for the world. So it made all the sense in the world for us to go to the UAE for those reasons. So here we're building an R&D facility, from what we understand, the biggest R&D facility focused on vertical farming in the world, in Abu Dhabi. And we're bringing partners from all over the world to innovate with us. And here those partners include Cargill. We had an announcement of growing cacao, what the ingredient for chocolate, as an example. That's going to go on in our facility in the UAE. We're also growing strawberries. We're going to grow strawberries in the facility here in the UAE, also growing leafy greens, all to advance technology, reduce capital cost, reduce operating cost, while improving the amount of varieties and the quality of varieties. I'm also happy to share that we're using some innovative technology from Israel. So in that sense, it's an example of the Abraham Accords, of how a US company can work in the UAE, building R&D, taking technology out of Israel. There's a lot of great ag tech coming out of the country to accelerate innovation cycles, to put creative solutions there as well. And the easy access between Israel and the UAE certainly now weighed in on the decision of which technology to integrate there. And it's going to be fantastic. And it's going to be that hub, that innovation hub, working with local universities to bring people together, to convene, to innovate faster, because there are a lot of problems to solve.
It's interesting that an agri-commodity giant like Cargill can be nimble enough to work on R&D and innovation at that level with a company like AeroFarms. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and here, we work with lots of big companies, small companies. We're doing work on new genetics, on with robotics, we'll also integrate a machine vision system with Nokia Bell Labs, another big company, where we could image every plant every day on big farms, on small farms, with a drone system that there's a lot of information from a camera, the length, size of the leaf, the discoloration, color, spotting, ripping, all of these features. But again, we're inviting all these big companies, small companies to innovate on our platform. And some of the solutions aren't just relevant to vertical farming, but it's relevant to the field. So we are sort of unlocking this mystery of plant biology, because we could perform scientific discovery in a fully controlled environment that you really don't have in a greenhouse or in the field, because the weather does what it wants to do. So there's a great opportunity for society, for AeroFarms, for innovation hub to really take plant science to a whole nother level.
Climate change is the topic today as much as anything, but also we have urbanization, which has been a really powerful trend for decades now. More and more people moving to cities. Cities are actually shorter of agricultural space. They, perhaps It's linked to why, as you were touched upon, about the centralization of the food industry. But for what you're doing, David, vertical farming, what kind of opportunity does it represent for cities? I mean, I've got the phrase here, urban food deserts. I don't know if that's too dramatic or it's accurate, but as more people move to cities, as cities become bigger and there is more demand, how can vertical farming fit into that future?
It provides resiliency for cities. So from a food security standpoint, they get to source locally, which if there are disruptions in the supply chain, they're buffered from that. If there are geopolitical tensions, they're buffered from that because they can produce their own food. Also, with technology, we're able to do, as mentioned earlier, more with less. So how do we use less water? How do we use less energy? How do we get more utilization from a seed? All from nutrients, from micronutrients. So it's enabling that self-sufficiency, which is vital for our communities, and it's de-risking elements even in COVID. So as our world, whether it's climate change, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's disease, all of these areas have impact and negative impact on our food supply chains, where we could create resiliency that's not always in the calculus of commerce, of what the economics are, but it has a real value. And if we could bring that value, and that's where public-private partnerships are important, just because business doesn't necessarily calculate that self-sufficiency or that buffer of certain disasters. When we integrate it in a certain way, then it's important and it really helps launch new technologies, new innovation. And same with climate change, where carbon isn't necessarily captured in commerce. But this is where policy can go put in standards where it's part of the calculus, and good actors or actors that push innovation, push standards are rewarded.
Minister Almheiri, at the highest level, countries are working toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Recently the COVID-19 pandemic revealed, where the kind of weaknesses are, in particular, as we've discussed already today, about food systems. But, the numbers are quite staggering. Last year, the number of undernourished people in the world continued to rise. 720 to 811 million people are facing hunger, in that time period. Our governments, because SDGs are long-term, but we have this sort of urgent short-term consideration. How do governments address that? How do they tie all of this together? What the likes of David are doing, what countries are trying to do to not only meet the SDGs, but also to tackle these immediate crises that we seem to be facing every year at the moment.
Yeah. Let me tell you something, Mustafa, just a short story about what happened in the UAE. So I was appointed in 2017 as a Minister for Food Security. At that time, I then got together with all the stakeholders of the country. We developed a plan for the country for food security. So it was called the National Plan, the National Strategy, the National Food Security Strategy. This strategy was launched in 2018. In 2019, we launched the governance model for implementing this strategy. So all this was because of political will, as David said. So the leadership said, we need to ensure that because we are a country that are very dependent on our global food supplies, 90% of our food is imported into the UAE. So the leadership said, we want to make sure that we're not just food secure today, but also food secure in the next 50 years. So we need a plan. We need someone who's accountable. We need someone to take the efforts of all the entities in the UAE to make sure we're all aligned and we're working towards a common goal. So this is, as David said, the political will and having a plan in place. So we had that in 2018. Then the governance model, of course, to implement. Because for every strategy, you need that vehicle to implement. Then COVID hits. And believe me, it was a test for us. It was a test to see how resilient were we. And because we had the political will, because we had a plan, because we had a governance model, I think we were able to maneuver all the challenges that we received, being very highly dependent on the global food supply networks. That we went through this without ever having any empty shelves of any of the main food commodities for the UAE people. So I think this was a big, let's say, success for us to show what it means to actually have political will, a plan, the partnerships that we have. And this is why, for me, moving forward, this was such a big lessons learned that I can only encourage other governments, because to be able to act as a global citizen and help others, you need to look nationally first and make sure that you have everything in place before you look outside, because food security is about ensuring that everybody in your country has access to safe, nutritious, affordable food at all times, including emergencies and crises. So for us, going through this exercise, what it really showed us is that we must look more inwards, as in looking at local systems when growing foods. We cannot grow all foods here in the UAE. It doesn't make sense when you think of sustainability and the amount of water that certain grains need. It doesn't make sense to grow rice or wheat here in the UAE. But, for example, Aero Farms is growing leafy greens, certain berries, now hopefully cacao. So all these things are some food items that now the private sector are saying, with the innovation that we have, with the business model that we have, it's starting to make sense to grow these items in a country such as the UAE. And this is what this is the transformation we're going through now. We're changing the blueprint of our country from a country that has been for many years a hub for food trade, which we want to keep, but also now to become a hub for innovation, technology, and knowledge when it comes to growing foods in hot, arid climates. And that's why within this, key is partnerships, as David said. Look at all the partnerships that he's able to attract through what he has made possible here. For us, it's as a government, it's really important to say, how can I attract the private sector or empower them to be able to grow? And so we did things like, we called it the accelerators, the government accelerators. And within this, we brought private sector entities, government authorities, academia, youth, women, the community members, and we brought everyone together and we said, okay, we want to grow the ag tech sector in the UAE. What are our bottlenecks? And as David describes them, what is our pain? Why can't they grow as we would like to see them grow? And believe me, just by having that conversation with the private sector, you are able to pinpoint what exactly the government has to do, because we're going through a transformation. We're going through, many years ago when technology wasn't so far, it didn't make sense to grow many things here. So farming in the UAE was kept at a very small level, traditional level. But now with the technologies available, we've been able to scale up. I mean, we're eating blueberries made in the UAE. We're eating salmon made in the UAE. We're eating quinoa made in the UAE, kale made in the UAE. So this is all because of technology, because we've really empowered the private sector. We've attracted them to come here. And it's just important that governments need to understand what are the enablers, what are the tools to be able to empower the private sector to blossom and develop sustainably when it comes to growing food locally. Also, we need to educate the people here to say, hey, buy locally. I know you're used to always getting your, let's say, tomatoes from the Netherlands, but actually we've got a lot of tomatoes here in the UAE too. So educating the people here to say, you can trust the local produce. And in the beginning, they're like, what's a closed system farm? This sounds very like lab-like. This sounds very unnatural. But going through that change of awareness, letting them visit the farms, letting them taste, letting them see that actually in these closed environments, you're actually looking at more cleaner foods because you don't have to use the pesticides, you don't have to use the chemical fertilizers. So this was all an educational journey as well, to say buy locally, to encourage that pull on the food systems locally. And not forgetting something very important is waste. There's a lot we need to do when it comes to reducing food loss and food waste, which automatically is also connected to our food systems as well. So there's a lot of educational side, there's on the policy side, but mainly I would say I summarize them in 3 Ps: the political will, having a plan, and the partnerships. With that, you can really pull the food systems transformation. You can attract the youth into this new way of growing. I mean, if I tell a young person, say, hey, you want to become a farmer? Or hey, you want to become an agri-technologist? Of course, they're going to go for it. Sounds much cooler to be an agri-technologist. So getting youth, women, and as you mentioned, Mustafa, farms are now going into the cities. We're seeing warehouses that are being turned into a farm, which then helps also that women come more into the sector because they also want to be closer to their families. We start looking at things like having internships also from university students coming in and just seeing what ag tech is about. So we're really seeing this transformation. And I think also, as you said, the political will is so important in this.
Thank you, Minister. David, I wonder if we could pick up on what the Minister said about raising awareness. So whether it's consumers or investors, how important is it that there becomes a growing awareness about what types of food we should be looking to eat, looking to buy? And, you know, when we're in the aisles of the supermarket, it seems people are more mindful. Are you seeing this?
Yeah, so two points I'll raise there. One is the trends are going towards fresh food. People, maybe it's COVID, people are more aware of health. They're asking, it's wonderful, they're asking questions. It's not just about what they eat, but how it was produced. So there's more awareness of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. When you take a step back, those are chemicals meant to kill things, weeds, bugs, etc., not for human digestion. And here we're proud that we don't grow with organic pesticides, we grow with 0 pesticides. So it's like taking it to another level. Even organic pesticides, I joke around that snake venom, it's organic, doesn't mean you want it in you. But here it's like taking the standards to a whole nother level, growing with 0. And we're trying to tell these stories, make people aware, and it's exciting. They're, again, asking not just the what, but the how. And with that, Aero Farms has started to brand. So we started to tell the how on the front of the label. We used to just keep it on the back of the label, not hiding it, but not leading with it. And now we're leading with the how we grow. And the key messages are flavor. And here, because of the full control, we're able to influence pepperiness, sweetness, bitterness, different ways of stressing a plant with temperature, humidity. They actually grow differently. Just like if we, as human beings, if we exercise, sleep differently, eat differently, it changes our biochemistry. In the same way, we essentially do that to the plant, and we could change their phytochemistry, but get the attributes a little different in color, a little different in texture, et cetera, et cetera. And we're leading with those messages of flavor, local, fresh, and safe, pesticide-free. The other thing we're doing, and back to education, is starting to educate our young. Food habits are developed at an early stage. And after a certain age, it's just like, it's hard. Some people have a harder time trying new foods. As an example, leafy greens. If you don't grow up eating leafy greens, which are arguably the most, not arguably, they are the most nutritious food group of all the food groups, and that's nutrition per calorie, then it just looks like a funny looking green food. So in the US, as an example, Michelle Obama got behind an initiative for Aero Farms of farms in schools, where we put a farm in a school. It's run by the kids. They seed, they grow, they harvest, they eat. And there's more excitement, not only because they're interacting with the farm, albeit an unconventional farm, but it's a farm. And then they're also eating the fruits or the vegetables of their labor. And that connection, where you also have accelerated crop cycles, where we grow a plant in on average 14 days, what's otherwise 40 days. So kids have a shorter attention cycle, and seeing the plants grow fast, it's fun and exciting. It increases curiosity, increases that desire to eat the food. And then they're choosing the greens over the potato chips. So this is an initiative we hope to roll out more and more. We're doing so in the US, hopefully in the UAE, but the young are a key part of this equation and how we get people to eat the right food.
I think you need to meet my children. They could do with broadening their palates. We're going to wrap up shortly, but would be great to get from both of you. This is really probably the hardest task of the day. In one word, how would you describe the future of sustainability? To you, David, first.
Fierce. And I say that because we have to go fierce, and like, this is a job for the bold. We have to be bold. We have to do it now. We have to do it fast. And we have to be fierce in our focus and our mission and our desire and our political will.
Thank you. And Minister?
Gosh, if I put it in one word, so I think of the word together. So partnerships, really important. Definitely bold. We need to be bold because it's sometimes a bit like, okay, can this really work? This is something new, so you have to be open for it. Just as an example, cellular agriculture is also it's coming really, really strong. And here in the UAE, for example, a lot of people don't know what it's about. So having the open mind and saying, you know what, I'm open for this, I want to try it, and understanding. And as David said, people are much more curious now. They want to know where things come from. So there's a lot more information that we must give to the consumers, and they are actually asking for it as well. So it's really difficult to put that all into one word, to be honest with you. But I think I've said more than I should say at the moment.
We've got some good words: together, bold, and fierce. I think that's a promising future. Let me thank our panel. Minister Almheiri, thank you so much.
Thank you.
David Rosenberg, thank you to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you both.
Thank you, and thank you to you watching for tuning in. You can see the entire session, the entire series on the Prize's YouTube channel. So please do check that out. Thank you again, our guests, for your valuable insights, and to the audience for listening. Do join us again next time.